All right, let's turn back to chapter 4 of the book of Jonah. Chapter 4. We've kind of given the overview of this book. Last week we were not online, being downstairs, and I'm getting ready for the Christmas musical up here. So we went through those chapters, literally of Jonah praying to God in chapter 2. Oh God, get me out of here. Oh God, thank you that you've called me to, you've called me to attention, and I'll do what you want me to do. And so, however much as I don't want to do it, and these people don't deserve it, I'm gonna go do it anyway. And so, God, would you come through? And of course, He spoke to that great fish that He had appointed. He vomited him out on dry land, and after he cleaned up, he made the 500-mile trek to where he was supposed to go in the first place. He went through a city which is called now the greatest revival that ever took place on this earth, as the entire city, just him preaching the message as he walked through, repent or God will destroy this nation or this city. And they turned to God, the entire city, from the smallest to the greatest, and it was the greatest revival that took place. Even the king sat in sackcloth and ashes, and so it was a great day of rejoicing for most people. Thus ended chapter 3, but not for Jonah. Jonah is still not pleased. Jonah's still not happy. Jonah's still prejudiced against these people. You know, there are people in life that are just, they're just sourpusses. Nothing makes them happy. You know, the sun can be shining bright, and they'll say, yeah, but the UV rays are giving me a sunburn. It's probably making cancer right now. I mean, it's something wrong with everything in the world, you know. Nothing like a cool, refreshing drink of water. Yeah, but too much chlorine. You know, nothing satisfies. Well, Jonah's one of those people. And listen, when you're out of sorts with God, you're out of sorts with everything else and everybody else. And so everything is affected. When a person is running from God and what God's will is, and interestingly enough, we'll see the other side of that come this Sunday. But when we think about that, we think about the fact that as he's running from God, he's still not satisfied, obviously, because of what takes place. So let's pick up in chapter 4 because we want to get through these 11 verses tonight. And the whole city came, and God saw their works. He saw that they turned from their evil ways. And by the way, that is the only thing that will bring about revival. It's the only thing that will bring about real salvation, is turning from our wicked ways. 2 Chronicles 7:14. It's not just to say I'm going to do something, but it's to do it. So he saw how they had repented, how they actually turned from their wicked ways, and he relented from the disaster that was at hand that he was going to bring upon them, and so he did not do it. That's how chapter 3 ends. So pick up in chapter 4. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. Wow. What a statement is made in that particular verse, because he had rejected the Gentiles. There are those who are still Jews who reject anybody else. There are those who have a superior mindset, and they tend to look down on everybody else. But by the way, the Muslims look down on everybody else, and the Hindus look down on everybody else, and the Buddhists look down on everybody else, and the Christians look down on everybody else. Y'all all right? And by the way, we as Americans can look down on everybody else. They're not exactly like us, don't exactly look like us, talk like us, come from the wrong part of the nation. Whatever it may happen to be, somebody's different. We get, as the old man said, sot in our ways. And we don't like that kind of change, and we don't like this, and we don't like that. And so until the heart changes, nothing changes. So Jonah's displeased. He was angry to have to go in the first place. He's angry to still have to go. I can see him kicking sand all the way for 500 miles. To get up there to preach a message that he didn't want to preach to a people he didn't want to preach, because quite honestly, they don't deserve that. And before we get very harsh on Jonah, I would say the average American, and yes, the average American Christian looks at Muslims like that. I've quit the preaching and gone to meddling. But if you'd been raised like that all your life and you knew nothing different, it's what you would always know. But I can tell you this, our Jesus died for them as much as he did for us. And it's easy for us to say that, but to have to flesh that out, to never have known about Jesus, to never really realize him to be anything but a prophet that they recognize. We can, quite honestly, we can have our own prejudices, can't we? And by the way, all of us are prejudiced to some extent. It's just a matter of somewhere between 1 and 100. And some tend to be more prejudiced. Sometimes age makes a person more prejudiced in a certain way. So I'll leave it there. He was angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Is this not what I knew would take place? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God." Now think about what he's saying here. God, I went because I knew, as the old guy said, I knowed it. I knew that you were a good and merciful God. And I knew that you were gracious and you were going to actually save these people. Is there anybody you despise so much that you don't even want them saved? It's interesting to hear people talk. Sometimes we're more concerned about their feelings, what they feel about things, than actually talking to them about the only thing that's really ultimately going to matter, and that's their own salvation. Or maybe it is the fact that, well, I hope they don't go to hell, but that's about all I can say. Maybe we're just that prejudiced to the point of we have something in our heart that we could despise anybody. But when we begin to look at everybody through the eyes of Jesus, that helps us to see that everybody needs to hear the gospel. Everybody needs to have an opportunity to hear the gospel. But Jonah wasn't there. His prejudice went over it. But he did say some positive things. God, I knew you were gracious, God. Is he not gracious? He ain't ever been nothing but good to me, as that song says. And that's who our God is. And he's merciful. The fact that he saved us shows that he is a merciful God. And so he shows mercy, and he expects us also as recipients of mercy to be merciful to others. And so he says, I know you're a gracious God, a merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. So he's going through all these great attributes of God, about the character of God and who he is. You're slow to anger, you're abundant loving kindness, and Lord, you don't really want to do harm. Do you know that God gets no joy from the death of the wicked? There's no joy there. Why? When he sent his only son from heaven to die on the cross for their sins and they rejected, why would it bring him great joy to do what he said he was going to have to do in sentencing them to an eternity in the lake of fire? So it doesn't bring him any joy in being able to do that. So in verse 3, as he starts talking about all this, and his let's just say his reaction is totally opposite what it should have been. That's the easy way of saying it. In verse 3, therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live. God, I'd rather, we'll put it in New Testament terminology, I'd rather die than have to baptize these guys. I'd rather die than have to go to a worship experience with them. I'd rather die than have to see them. Jonah's still there. Can you see how, listen, a carnal Christian has been said to be one of the meanest people in the world. They can see things in such a negative fashion because they know what should be and they're not where they should be, and so they see things completely different. They're walking completely out of the will of God, and of course that's where we find Jonah tonight here in what we're trying to say. So notice how God begins to deal with him here. And the Lord said to him in verse 4, is it right for you to be angry? I think that's a fair question. Jonah, do you have a right to be angry? By the way, who appointed you God? And I never even appointed you the next person down. Who are you? There's not a person here tonight that's indispensable in the work of God. We are here but for a season. We are here but for a time. But fulfill God's will while we have time. Jonah, you preach to these people, but you've got less people than ever to preach to now. Because I want you to notice something when we get to the end of this chapter. You never hear another thing about Jonah. You won't hear a thing. Some people write their own obituary spiritually. They write their own epitaph. And people tend to remember how you were and kind of how you go out. And it's kind of the case with Jonah here, and it's really kind of sad. I mean, for anybody who had a whale of a story. Sorry, it was too tempting to let go of there. God asked him, do you have a real good reason to be angry? That's thought-provoking. The obvious answer is no, I don't. I knew who you were. I knew what you would do. But he is just prejudiced in every way. Wow, what a thing to say. When you think about this, you think about his attitude, and let's parallel Luke chapter 15 and the prodigal son. Think about the loving father, but also think about the prodigal brother. You've got the brother who stayed at home, but his heart was not at home. His heart was a guilty distance away. And he did nothing but accuse his father of taking back this good-for-nothing son. I've been faithful to you. I've been here all this time. You allow that creature to come back, and you even reward him with a cloak. You reward him with a ring. You're killing the fatted calf. Man, you've never done anything like that for me. But son, you've been here all the time, and this is my son I thought was even dead, and he's come home. It's reason to celebrate. Now, that's the picture of Jonah here. Jonah's not, he's not a prodigal who's come home. He's still really not come home, and we're going to see that the story kind of continues on that vein as we go through chapter 4 here. So God just asked him the thought-provoking question. You have a real good reason to be angry? You know, since I've called you, and since I've used you, and since of all people in the world I gave you the responsibility to go preach this message to them of repentance, and they turned, you ought to be the person that's most overjoyed. By the way, for those of you who have led someone to Christ, it will be the greatest joy in your life besides your own personal salvation, leading someone else to Christ. And so you ought to be the one that's rejoicing in this fact. You ought to be the one who is just overjoyed because of what has taken place, and yet you're not. So what does Jonah do? Notice verse 5. So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city. There he made himself a shelter and sat down under it in the shade till he might see what would become of the city. That's when you know he's Baptist. He's the person who sits back in the pew and says, let's just see what they'll do. Person gets saved, let's just see how long they last. See if they speak to me first, because I'm not going to speak to them. See if they come to me, because I'm